Imagine you're living peacefully in a small coastal village in England. It's the year 793. You're a monk. You're copying religious texts. Life is quiet. Then suddenly, ships appear on the horizon. Long, narrow, dragon-headed, fast. Men jump out. Axes, shields, beards. Zero interest in negotiation. That was the Vikings. But here's the twist. They weren't just raiders. They were traders, explorers, settlers, lawmakers, and surprisingly organized. This is the real history of the Vikings. First, important detail. Viking wasn't an ethnicity. It was more of a job description. The Vikings were Norse people from Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and the word Viking roughly meant to go on a raid. So not every Scandinavian was a Viking. But if you grabbed an axe and boarded a ship, congratulations, you were now Viking. So why did they suddenly start showing up everywhere? Several reasons. Population growth, limited farmland, political changes, and honestly, opportunity. Europe at the time had wealthy monasteries. And monasteries were rich, poorly defended, located near water. From a Viking perspective, convenient. The famous raid on Lindisfarne in 793 shocked Europe. It marked the beginning of what we call the Viking Age. Let's talk about why they were so successful. Their ships. Viking longships were fast, lightweight, flexible, able to sail oceans, able to travel shallow rivers. This meant they could sail across the North Sea, then suddenly appear inland via rivers. It was basically medieval surprise mode. You could not see them coming. Okay, yes, they raided. Yes, they were brutal in attacks. But here's what most people miss. They also traded extensively. Vikings traveled as far as Constantinople, the Middle East, Russia, North Africa. They traded furs, silver, slaves, amber, weapons. Some Vikings became mercenaries. Others became merchants. Many settled permanently in places like England, Ireland, France, Normandy, Iceland. So no, they weren't just chaos in boats. They were economically strategic. Let's talk about the raids. Because yes, they raided. And they were very, very good at it. But here's what made Viking raids terrifying. They were fast. They were sudden. And they were coordinated. A Viking raid didn't begin with a dramatic battle speech. It began with silence. Longships would appear on the horizon, low in the water, fast, almost gliding. These ships could sail across open ocean, navigate shallow rivers, land almost anywhere. No need for deep harbors. They could pull right up onto a beach. Imagine being in a quiet monastery, and suddenly someone shouts, "Ships!" That's it. No warning system. No coast guard. No medieval hotline. Just ships. The Vikings relied on surprise. They would land quickly and strike immediately. Monasteries were prime targets because they were wealthy, isolated, poorly defended. Inside were gold chalices, silver crosses, manuscripts, and valuables. The monks, not trained soldiers. From the Viking perspective, this was efficient. From the monks' perspective, this was a very bad day. Viking raids were violent. They killed resistance. They looted valuables. They burned buildings. They captured people to sell as slaves. Slavery was a major part of Viking trade. Captured men and women were sold across Europe, and even into the Middle East. It was brutal. This wasn't cinematic Hollywood combat. It was economic violence. Take wealth. Remove resistance. Leave quickly. The goal wasn't conquest, at least not early on. It was speed and profit. Here's the genius part. They didn't stick around. They grabbed what they could and left fast. By the time a local lord gathered soldiers, the Vikings were already back at sea. This hit-and-run style made them nearly impossible to catch. They weren't trying to hold territory. They were trying to maximize efficiency. It was terrifying because it felt random. Coastal Europe basically had permanent anxiety for 300 years. If you lived near water, you slept lightly. Europe at the time was deeply Christian. Monasteries were considered sacred spaces. So when Viking raiders attacked religious centers, it felt apocalyptic. Some medieval writers described the Vikings as God's punishment, not because they had horns, but because they were unpredictable and unstoppable. Not every Viking expedition was a massacre. Many raids evolved into trade missions, settlements, negotiated payments. Sometimes local rulers paid Vikings to leave. Imagine paying someone protection money from themselves. Over time, Vikings shifted from raiding to settling. In places like England and France, they stopped being raiders. They became neighbors. Which must have been awkward. Remember when you burned our monastery? Yeah, sorry about that. Nice farm you've got. Because early raids were so shocking, the Vikings earned a legendary reputation. And reputation is powerful. Sometimes towns surrendered before fighting. Fear became part of their strategy. They didn't need to attack everywhere. The idea that they might show up was enough. That's psychological warfare. Medieval edition. At one point, large parts of England were under Viking control. This area was called the Danelaw. They didn't just burn everything down and leave. They built towns, farmed land, intermarried, created laws. Eventually, Viking leaders even became kings of England. Yes, the raiders became rulers. History loves irony. Here's something wild. Around the year 1000, a Viking named Leif Erikson reached North America. That's nearly 500 years before Columbus. They called it Vinland. They even built small settlements. But the colonies didn't last. Distance, conflict, logistics. Still, Vikings crossed the Atlantic in wooden ships. That's impressive. They weren't just warriors. Viking society had farmers, blacksmiths, shipbuilders, traders, women who owned property, legal assemblies called things. Yes, they literally held public meetings called things. And people would debate laws. Viking democracy. Shocking, right? For nearly 300 years, Vikings were everywhere. England, Ireland, France, Russia, the Mediterranean, even North America. If there was water nearby, odds were, so were they. So what happened? Did they just wake up one day and say, you know what? Let's settle down. Not exactly. The Viking Age didn't explode. It slowly faded. And here's why. At first, Vikings followed Norse pagan beliefs. Odin, Thor, Loki, Valhalla, glorious battle deaths. Raiding kind of fit the worldview. But starting in the 900s, Christianity began spreading through Scandinavia. Kings converted first, often for political reasons. If you wanted to trade with Christian Europe, it helped to also be Christian. And once kings converted, their kingdoms followed. Raiding monasteries gets complicated when your own king is now Christian. Suddenly, those monasteries weren't just treasure vaults. They were holy sites. Awkward. As Christianity spread, the old raiding culture started to lose legitimacy. Early Viking society was decentralized. Local chieftains, independent war bands, flexible power structures. But over time, Scandinavia formed centralized kingdoms. Norway unified. Denmark strengthened. Sweden consolidated power. And once you have organized monarchies, you need taxes, laws, stability, trade agreements. Raiding your neighbors every summer isn't great for diplomatic relations. Kings preferred controlled expansion over chaotic piracy. Vikings didn't disappear. They became administrators, which is slightly less cinematic. Trade was more profitable than burning things. Early Viking raids were high risk, high reward. But as trade networks expanded, commerce became smarter. Why burn a town when you can trade with it every year? Viking merchants were connecting Europe to the Islamic world, Byzantium, the Baltic, Russia. Silver flowed in. Luxury goods moved. Slavery shifted into structured markets. Trade created wealth without constant warfare. Stability started looking appealing. Europe didn't just sit there forever. Kingdoms fortified coastlines, built stronger defenses, organized standing armies. The element of surprise started fading. The easy monastery raids of the 700s? Not so easy anymore by the 1000s. It turns out, if you raid someone for 200 years, eventually they prepare. Rude. The final dramatic chapter came in 1066. A Norwegian king named Harald Hardrada attempted one last major Viking invasion of England. Big fleet. Big ambition. Classic Viking energy. He fought at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. And lost. Badly. He was killed in battle. That defeat is often seen as the symbolic end of the Viking Age. The era of large-scale Viking invasions was over. But here's the twist. Later that same year, England was conquered again. By William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy. And Normandy, originally settled by Vikings. They had just converted to Christianity, learned French, adopted new armor, and rebranded. They weren't Vikings anymore. They were Normans. Same roots. New logo. History loves a good rebrand. So did Vikings disappear? No, they didn't vanish. They evolved. Their descendants ruled England, shaped France, influenced Russia, integrated into Europe. The Viking Age ended. But Viking bloodlines and culture didn't. They just stopped arriving by dragon ship. One last thing. They did not wear horned helmets. That's a 19th century television invention. Real Viking helmets were practical. No horns. Because horns in battle would be inconvenient. Were they violent? Yes. Were they uniquely violent compared to the era? Not exactly. Medieval Europe was already brutal. The Vikings were just very efficient at it. And very mobile. And very dramatic about arriving by dragon-headed ship. Which, let's be honest, is unforgettable branding. If this made the Vikings make sense, subscribe to History Simplified. Because history isn't just what you've heard. It's usually more complicated, more surprising, and way more interesting.